Hello, my name is Douglas Kilmer, and I'm president of the United States National Committee of the International Council on Monuments and Sites. I welcome you to this webinar, one that I've been looking forward to, on diversifying heritage in the United States. This webinar is part of the U.S. ICOMOS observation of World Heritage Day, which occurred on April 11, but has been transformed into something that might better be called World Heritage Week. Even before World Heritage Day, on April 14, a group of our emerging professionals organized an intergenerational conversation on society and heritage, perspectives from Africa and the United States. On April 18, US ICOMOS posted webinar recordings of sessions that we have held on social justice and world heritage. Our event today also occurs during National Park Week. And in fact, 20 of the World Heritage Sites in the United States are also units of the National Park System. Now, when many of these were inscribed on the World Heritage List, they were listed as natural sites. US ICOMOS is working to acknowledge and inform the public and decision makers that all these sites have ties with diverse cultures. Many, if not most, for example, were the homelands of Native American groups from which they were ejected. This has been a loss to us all. One dimension of this loss is that it serves to legitimate an artificial separation of the cultural from the natural, when in fact, the two are inextricably intertwined. This inseparability is recognized by Native American groups and others who have been largely excluded from the stories that we tell and the histories that we write. We should benefit from their wisdom, and doing so would be a giant step in forming the new heritage that we seek. The webinar will begin with a keynote presentation by Shantha Ready Alonso, Director of Intergovernmental and External Affairs, U.S. Department of the Interior, who will speak about the agency's commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion. Shantha's presentation will be followed by short presentations and a panel discussion by 4 professionals sharing their diverse perspectives on U.S. heritage and what we can do to make our programs and society as a whole more just and inclusive. And with that, I turn it over to Shantha. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for this opportunity to participate in this webinar and say a few words about the Department of the Interior's priorities. I'm Shantha Ready Alonso, Director of Intergovernmental and External Affairs at the U.S. Department of the Interior. And in this role, I engage with state and local government officials, as well as tribes, and a diverse range of stakeholders to help the department achieve its mission and its goals. It is an honor to be speaking alongside this distinguished and diverse panel of representatives doing impressive work to achieve diversity and social justice in conservation. I was particularly excited to speak at this event because of its focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion, which are top priorities for the Biden-Harris administration and me. I started my federal government service on Inauguration Day, January 20th, and before joining the Biden-Harris administration, I spent 10 years in the nonprofit sector with faith-based organizations. My education background is in social work and theology, and some of my most powerful experiences of my career leading up to my new political appointment related to my work with coalitions to advance diversity, equity, and inclusion in the conservation movement. My entry point to this movement was focused on conserving our country's spiritual heritage, but over time, I grew in my understanding of how important it is for our entire system of public lands and waters to respect, reflect, and engage the true diversity of our country. This means that the special places and stories that we invest in highlighting and conserving should reflect our country's full diversity. Diverse communities should have affordable and equitable access to our country's conserved natural, cultural, historical, and spiritual heritage. Engagement in the conservation process should involve diverse communities who should be meaningfully involved in every step of the way in conservation policymaking processes. And the full spectrum of the conservation workforce should look like America. This is especially important when it comes to the interpretive and community engagement work. A diverse workforce of interpreters will tell a more complete, rich American story. In my time before coming to the Biden-Harris administration, I was one of many advocates who care about diversity, equity, and inclusion in conservation, and I was part of a coalition that encouraged the Obama administration to formally outline concrete actions that could be taken to better respect, reflect, and engage more communities. I was thrilled that there were actionable items in President Obama's memorandum issued in January 2017 on promoting diversity and inclusion in our national parks, national forests, and other public lands and waters. Many of the items in this memorandum still need our attention. Now, I am honored to be part of the Biden-Harris administration's agenda, and this administration has both the ambition and the plans to advance diversity, equity, and inclusion throughout the federal government, including the agenda on climate conservation and equity. And some of the top initiatives of this administration were named and outlined in President Biden's first week of executive orders. In his Tackling the Climate Crisis at Home and Abroad executive order, there are heritage conservation equities in the establishment of the Civilian Climate Corps, the initiative to conserve 30% of U.S. lands and waters by 2030, and the Environmental Justice 40 initiative to ensure at least 40% of federal government resources benefit disadvantaged communities. First, the Civilian Climate Corps. A critical part of President Biden's plan to build back better, the Civilian Climate Corps will create good jobs for the next generation while conserving and restoring our public lands and waters. This initiative will provide training for necessary job skills and provide a pipeline for a new workforce that looks like America, creating opportunities for those from underserved communities, Native American and Alaska Native tribes, returning veterans, and young people, among others. The 30 by 30 initiative, President Biden has pledged to protect biodiversity, slow extinction rates, and leverage natural climate solutions by conserving at least 30% of the nation's undeveloped lands and waters by 2030. The work of the Department of the Interior is central to the President's 30 by 30 goal, and to succeed, we will need to work with a diverse range of state, local, tribal, and territorial governments and stakeholders. We have and will continue to prioritize consultations with tribes and Indigenous communities, and urban conservation organizations, as well as people of color organizations, focusing on access to nature will be key partners in our 30 by 30 efforts as well. Then there's the Justice 40 Environmental Justice Initiative to ensure 40% or more of eligible federal government funds flow to disadvantaged communities, redressing racial and economic inequality. This will be incorporated as a specific priority within the 30 by 30 and CCC initiatives, and improve access to nature for low-income and minority communities. This will be a major focus of the Department of the Interior. So of the 24 World Heritage Sites in the United States, nearly 80% of them are national parks. As stewards of our public lands and waters, I would like to take some time today to explore both the successes and future opportunities of the Department of the Interior and the National Park Service specifically, as we work to achieve diversity, equity, and inclusion. Looking forward, we recognize that we must intentionally commit to reflecting the mosaic of experiences represented in its stewardship, storytelling, visitor experience, and hiring. Across the department, we are committed to identifying proactive strategies to better hire, welcome, promote, and retain staff from underserved communities, people with disabilities, people of color, and others who may have been undervalued or underrepresented in our workforce. We also are committed to examining and addressing organizational obstacles to becoming a diverse and inclusive agency, one where all employees feel welcome to engage in working toward a better future together. The National Park Service has been looking at gaps in their sites to ensure the designation of new sites related to diverse heritage that reach LGBTQ, Asian American Pacific Islander, Latino, African American, and Native American communities. Many of the recent additions to the National Park System preserve and tell stories of diverse communities, and many of our longstanding units tell those stories as well. New units like the Reconstruction Era National Historic Park in Mississippi and the Birmingham Civil Rights National Monument in Alabama, as well as long-standing units like the Martin Luther King Jr. National Historic Park in Georgia, Frederick Douglass National Historic Site in Washington, D.C., and the Selma to Montgomery National Historic Trail in Alabama, all tell the story of the struggle for social equity for African Americans in the United States and highlight leaders of the civil rights movement. They preserve places where great ideas for progress were incubated and hatched, sites where the country made equality gains for African Americans, and sites of struggle and tragedy that ensure we will never forget the sacrifice of those who fought valiantly for equal rights. National Park Service has a network of sites dedicated to the history of Asian American and Pacific Islander experience, ranging from cultural and archaeological sites in Hawaii that preserve and interpret Native Hawaiian culture, to a variety of World War II Japanese American confinement sites, like Manzanar National Historic Site in California, which has been a unit for over 20 years. The long fight for equal rights for women is reflected in sites as diverse as the Rosie the Riveter World War II Homefront National Historic Park in California, where women joined the workforce to help win the war, and the still relatively new Belmont Paul Women's Equality National Monument, established in 2016 in Washington, D.C., which preserves the headquarters of the National Women's Party, the epicenter of the struggle for women's rights to vote. The Stonewall National Monument in New York preserves the location of the 1969 Stonewall Uprising, which provided momentum to LGBTQ equality during a time when LGBTQ people were often the target of discriminatory laws. The establishment of Stonewall in 2016 created the first national park dedicated to preserving and interpreting LGBTQ history and rights in the United States. Parks such as Gateway National Recreation Area in New York, Vicksburg National Military Park in Mississippi, Little Bighorn Battlefield National Monument in Montana, and many other units also boast lesser-known stories from LGBTQ history. The National Park Service also tells the stories of Hispanic, Latino, Latinx history, such as Cesar Chavez National Monument in California, home of one of the most important Latino leaders in American history, and the Pullman National Monument in Illinois, where the 1894 strike and boycott helped shape the history of organized labor. These units, some new and some longstanding, helped ensure that our national park system is reflective of the broad spectrum of cultural heritage in the United States. However, it is important to ensure complex and comprehensive representation of these communities paint the full picture. For instance, the vast majority of Native American sites have represented their history, but through these sites, we have the opportunity and room to grow in raising awareness on modern-day tribes' civil rights and uses of these areas today. We recognize the importance of telling the stories of every group and also the stories of mutual experience and empathy. In common struggles and triumphs, intersect and connect our history through unifying historic themes, such as engaging with the environment, developing the American economy, and shaping the political landscape. As the National Park Service looks forward to commemorating the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence and the formation of our country, it is committed to telling the nation's full story. Along with the recent commemorations of the 400th anniversary of enslaved Africans' arrival in Virginia and the centennial of the suffrage movement, the 19th Amendment, these events provide platforms to engage historically disenfranchised communities and expand our access to places and stories that belong to all Americans. As the Department of the Interior, we recognize that embedding diverse voices in our culture requires not only stories, but also the preservation and stewardship of real places in our protected lands and in our communities. The 24 World Heritage Sites in the U.S. reflect the diversity of the history of the country, including the first peoples of this country. These include Taos Pueblo, Mesa Verde, the San Antonio Missions, and Poverty Point. Under the leadership of Secretary Holland, the first Native American to lead a cabinet agency, we are committed to telling the stories of all Americans. We consider this commitment a critical part of our federal responsibility to serve all constituents. A prime example of this continued commitment to diversity and inclusion in our protected spaces is the Papahanaumokuakea Marine National Monument, one of the world's largest protected areas. This monument was added to the World Heritage List in 2010, becoming the first mixed cultural and natural World Heritage Site in the United States. The area is of great significance to Native Hawaiians, who also play an important role in the management of the site, along with the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Association, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and the state of Hawaii. Native Hawaiian cultural values and interests are central to the monument's planning and decision-making processes. The National Park Service is also working with the Ohio History Connection and Hopewell Culture National Historical Park to reflect a World Heritage nomination, the Hopewell Ceremonial Earthworks, focused on the 2,000-year-old earthworks in central and southern Ohio. These large earthworks involve precise dimensions and geometric shapes that are aligned with astronomical movements, demonstrating sophisticated mathematical knowledge. The nomination has been endorsed by the National Congress of American Indians, the Intertribal Council representing tribes in Northeast Oklahoma, and the Seneca Nation of New York State, who hope to see the earthworks preserved as examples of accomplishments of Indigenous peoples. Beyond the World Heritage Program, the National Park Service is taking steps to incorporate diversity, equity, and inclusion in other efforts. The National Park Service offers a number of grant programs to states, tribes, and local governments, such as underrepresented community grants, which supports the identification and nomination of sites to the National Register of Historic Places and focuses on documenting the homes, lives, landscapes, and experiences of underrepresented peoples who have played a significant role in national history. Since the establishment of the Underrepresented Community Grants in 2014, there have been over 50 successful projects that have added African American, Asian American, Latino, LGBTQ, and Native American historic properties to the National Register of Historic Places. The National Park Service is also reaching out to partners in other countries to share lessons learned on how to ensure diversity and equity in access to parks and protected lands. As an example, 2 weeks ago, the Park Service helped to host a webinar on accessibility in national parks alongside counterparts from Lithuania's national parks. Partnering with NOAA, the Lower Elwha Kalem Tribal Government, the Government of Chile, and others, the Park Service is developing an international workshop on Indigenous communities and protected areas to be held in Olympic National Park, a World Heritage Site, in 2022. This will explore case studies and best practices from around the world and how to improve collaboration between Indigenous communities and protected area managers. The Department of the Interior recognizes its important role and responsibility as stewards of Indigenous land and is striving to build relationships to give voice to First Peoples of this land. The National Office of Interpretation and Education within the National Park Service supports the national park units across the nation in their effort to build strong, respectful, and lasting relationships with their affiliated Indigenous nations. 3 specific programs include scholarships for rangers to participate in the Cultural Heritage Tourism Certificate Program offered by the American Indian Alaska Native Tourism Association and Georgetown University. The Connecting with Our Homelands Travel Grant Program, which gives Native youth, along with their elders, the opportunity to visit their ancestral lands, walk in the tracks of people who came before them, and learn the history, resilience, and spiritual connection to these places through their elders. And the Cultural Exchange Program, currently being designed now with the goal of building bridges between the National Park Service interpretive rangers and Native communities. Through this program, rangers will be given the opportunity to visit tribal communities to build and grow relationships of understanding and friendship, to engage in historical and contemporary knowledge, to sit with the elders, and to share in cultural exchange. By virtue of the cultural heritage sites that are entrusted to the National Park Service, the work of interpretation closely aligns to that of social justice. The work of the Park Service is that of telling all Americans' history. And in order to do this work, the Park Service is striving to build internal capacity, skills, and practices in social justice and co-creation of program research and delivery. National parks and our protected spaces have the ability to represent history books that have not yet been written. To walk into these pages of history, visitors will be exposed to the complexities of who we are as the United States of America. By challenging narratives and ensuring everyone's history is told, we can allow communities to feel represented, heard, and seen. Diversifying heritage in the United States will require us to work together to change our systems and procedures to ensure that inclusion is built in and tell the stories of our inclusive history so that our shared culture sees all of us as belonging. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dorothy Firecloud, and I recently took on the position as the Native American Affairs Liaison for the National Park Service and report directly to the National Park Service Director. I am a member of the Sicango Lakota from the state of South Dakota. The slideshow that I'm showing during this time, because if I turn on my camera, it's going to crash. So unfortunately, I'm not able to do both. But the slideshow is composed of World Heritage National Park Service sites, along with several park units at the end that Indigenous people have special connections to. I am talking with you today from the ancestral homelands of the Hopi, Apache, Yavapai, Zuni, Pima, Maricopa, and O'odham nations, who all lived in the Verde Valley of Arizona at various times in the past and used the area as a major trade route between coastal, Southwest, and Plains tribes. The Verde Valley to this day still has what remains of over 800 pueblos, varying in size from a few families to several hundred inhabitants. The valley is currently tribal homelands of the combined Yavapai and Apache nations. We look forward to working with the new Secretary of Interior, Deb Haaland, and know that this topic is of importance to her and the Biden-Harris administration, as Shantha just highlighted. The next 4 years will be an exciting time for Indigenous people, and my hope is that within the next few years, Indigenous people will no longer be invisible, and that the heritage of this country will become more acutely diverse. The National Park Service, along with other federal agencies, are currently determining how to commemorate the 250th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. Within the National Park Service, this has brought out lots of soul searching. How do we tell that story completely, especially when it comes to the Indigenous peoples of this country? It will require lots of hard truths, which don't feel comfortable or fit with the stories that they hold to date. As you are all aware, the Declaration wasn't written that all men are created equal and with life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness to include Indigenous peoples, much the opposite. As a matter of fact, the 27th oppression spoke of the merciless Indian savages. In 1492, it was estimated that the Native American population north of the Rio Grande was anywhere from 7 to 15 million people. By the end of the Indian Wars, the population had been decimated to fewer than 238,000. It is time for us as a National Park Service to reckon with our place in American history if we hope to transform our relationships with tribes. We must begin to tell the hard stories, the stories of what happened to Indigenous peoples with the coming of the Euro-Americans. We have been, for at least the 15 years since I have been a National Park Service employee, attempting to determine how to get more people of color as visitors to our tremendous sites. We have looked at such things as expanding picnic and camping areas to hold larger groups with the hope that that would bring in more minority groups. That didn't work. We've done surveys to find out what we can do to be more inviting to people of color. Those haven't revealed anything of substance to help us in this effort. While working on the 250th, I have come to determine that what may be deterring many of these visitors from coming and enjoying the park sites is the fact that we don't tell those hard truths. We don't tell the stories of Indian slavery, of the failed boarding school era, the failed Indian relocation programs, the failed era of attempted termination of Indian people. We are afraid of telling those truths because it may cause some of our current visitors to take pause, and many may be offended or have a level of unease. We may even lose some of those visitors because they don't want to hear those stories. We don't tell the stories of the civil rights movement of Native peoples, with the exception of Alcatraz and the takeover. We don't tell the stories of contemporary Native American lives. We appear to be stuck back in the era of the federal government not recognizing Indigenous peoples as American citizens, and that has profoundly impacted the stories that we share, compromising the integrity of the National Park Service as a protector and preserver of our nation's stories. In many parks, you will find signage in the visitor centers which say, "We are still here," and have photos and description of local tribes and their people. However, that is as far as it goes. There are no other programs offered to further the discussion and provide additional educational opportunity for our visitors, except maybe during the month of November, which is Native American month. The biggest complaint throughout Indian country currently is the fact that Indigenous people are largely invisible. The greater majority doesn't realize how rich and full our lives are today. They are surprised to find out that many Native people have survived the various attempts of erasure on our peoples. However, we do have several parks that are working hard to ensure their visitors are told a complete story. And the picture is of the Grand Canyon, the largest of these projects being at Grand Canyon National Park, which will likely become the standard for other parks to meet. They are developing an entire area of the park, which is named Desert View Tribal Heritage Area, and will be dedicated to telling those stories of Native peoples in their own voice. There will be vendor areas, areas for artisans to show and explain their craft, areas for such activities as Pueblo bread baking in their centuries-old traditional ways. The Grand Canyon staff has been working extremely hard the past 3 to 4 years in consultation with the tribes to ensure that the area is done in concert with tribal input. They are also looking at how to reinvigorate the interpretive tribal stories told at the Tucson Museum, which is located not too far down the road from the tribal heritage area. The park superintendent is looking at ways to expand tribal hiring authorities and to work with the tribes in all other areas of park management. Really a new era of inclusion at the Grand Canyon. We have many superintendents within the National Park Service, both Indigenous and non, who are doing everything within their control to ensure that Native peoples are true partners in telling those hard stories and developing other means through which partnerships can flourish. The superintendent at Effigy Mounds is looking to develop a sister park relationship with the proposed Iowa Tribal National Park tribe. The staff at Apostle Islands recently developed a new park brochure, which includes the traditional Ojibwe names of the islands and other locations in the area. They are also updating their webpage to include recorded Ojibwe language audio of these place names, as well as the 13 Ojibwe moons and the Ojibwe words from the Junior Ranger Activity Guide, so people will know how the words sound in the native language. The superintendent of Knife River Indian Villages is Indigenous to the park, the first native caretaker since the late 1800s. The tribe couldn't be more proud. We have had a good start, but it can't stop there. And we must ensure that it doesn't until there is true equity amongst all Indigenous groups who have stories to share within our National Park Service system. We as the National Park Service reach millions of people yearly We have the perfect venue to work with Indigenous peoples to assist in diversifying the heritage in this country through storytelling. No other federal agency, with the exception of maybe the Smithsonian, has this ability. We must step up and work with Indigenous peoples to help them become visible. If we don't, I am afraid that it will jeopardize the foundation of our mission and our ability to take on the complex and interconnected issues of racial justice, climate change, and truth-telling. Within the National Park Service, this also means looking internally at our workforce and determining how to get and keep people of color as employees, because unfortunately, there is a current downward trend in the number of employees that are being, there's a current downward trend in the number of employees who are people of color. When employees retire, people of color are being replaced by non-people of color. However, this is a different discussion that we can do on another webinar in the future. And but it is being addressed in the near future to see what we can do to reverse that trend. So with that, I say Wopila, thank you. Remember, we are all connected, the earth and everything that is upon it. We must work together to protect her and the environment. And that, let's see, I will turn it over to Autumn. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Dorothy. I'm so excited to follow you and to share. Let me go to. Oh, all right. So, morning, afternoon, or evening, wherever you're joining us from. I'm joining you today from Northwest Washington, D.C., the traditional territory of the Natchez-Chenk, the Anacostia and Piscataway people. I want to acknowledge this legacy and the inspiration I receive from this land. This land acknowledgement is my way of recognizing Indigenous presence in our everyday life and centering my responsibility to consider what it means to acknowledge this history and legacy of colonialism and our history as a nation, as a community, and as American. So I am Autumn Saxton Ross. I'm the newly minted VP of Education and Chief Equity Officer for the National Park and Recreation Association. And I'm so happy to join you today and add perspectives that are rooted in local and state parks and their histories. So I always like to start with personal reflection. And so when I think about this, this is my local park. I'm a Kansas City girl, grew up in Kansas City, Missouri. And this is, Swole Park was one of my favorite parks. I grew up less than a mile from there. But I share this history because what a lot of folks don't know is that the integration of the pool that I learned to swim in, actually was Thurgood Marshall's practice run before the Brown versus Board of Education. It happened just over the state border in Kansas. This park was also, this is our Olmsted Park. This park is over 1,800 acres, one of the largest municipal parks actually in the United States. And it has our zoo, it has nature centers, it has the place where I held my first owl pellet. But I also share it because my grandmother, so this was Watermelon Hill. This was the only place in that 1,800 square acre park that Black folks could go to for years up until Brown versus Board of Education. And so up until the late 80s, this was the only part of the park that my grandmother ever took me to. And so I tell this story to connect to our history. It's important that we think about how current and past policies influence both access, right? Physical access, but also the perception of access and who is included and who should go other places. I am so lucky that my parents didn't have that perception and showed me so much more of that park. So I also want to share something about an organization that I know and love, Outdoor Afro. So this is a picture from my third leadership training in 2016. And so this was my first expansive national park. And I had just been hired as the Mid-Atlantic Regional Director for Nature Bridge. And so I got a chance to tour with my coworkers, but I was really here for this leadership training. And so for many of us lovers of the outdoors, this was our first trip to Yosemite National Park or anything similar in that large. The park staff greeted us with open arms and made sure we had what we needed to explore the park. And then this happened. So why do I share that? I share that because those comments, those feelings, that fear is part of our history too. And it's very easy to think that, oh, I'm so sorry that happened, that, this sucks. That history of racism hurts, insert community of color here. But what I'd like to offer you something different to consider. As I was preparing for this presentation, I came across an article from a colleague of mine, Natalie Burke, who's the CEO of Common Health Action. And she did an opinion piece in the Daily News entitled, "Want to be an anti-racist white ally? Here are 6 steps to follow." I encourage you to read the article, but what stuck with me that I felt compelled to share with you today is that as she talks about our history of race and racism, but she highlights an important point that we forget to talk about. As I said earlier, it's easy to think about racism and to be sad for those as we see being the victim, in this instance, Black folks. But what we rarely talk about are the other victims, the other side of the story, white folks. We don't speak or reflect on the harm that racism has done to the other side as well. Think about how harmful a system that supports folks, nice people, people that go to church, good people, right? That express these types of views to this post. The type of people that see a group of Black folks, their first time in a national park, expressing nothing but wonder and joy, to feel such hate, fear, and or irritation. I share this history with you because that is what at the National Recreation and Parks Association, our diversity, equity, and inclusion work is about. It is about creating a new atmosphere. Of course, we all love Fred Rogers. There's a world of difference between insisting on someone's doing something and establishing an atmosphere in which that person can grow into wanting to do it. And so our work is about creating a space, an atmosphere that supports learning and growth. So our approach, when we think about diversifying spaces, parks and recreation, whether local or state, is to really think and provide opportunities for our members and our staff, focusing on both systems and people, hard on systems and easy on people. So it's not just about increasing access, but also how we create a culture or an atmosphere of inclusion. As I've talked about this history and shared 2 examples, we can't only provide access, right? Because I had access to Yosemite. We also have to make sure that that space guarantees safety and is also welcoming. So we believe in being hard on systems and easy on people. And so for us, that means our work will provide opportunities or create a space ripe for learning that supports folks in exploring and examining how this system has impacted and harmed us all. And most importantly, how we can disrupt and change and maybe co-create new systems. The first piece of that is to really focus on what equity means for us. There are 3 points. Equity means for us that we lead with race because racial inequities persist in every system across the country: health, education, parks, and recreation. And so we must intentionally counteract those systems. We also uplift a core value of continuous learning. Continuous learning means, as an organization, we have a growth mindset and we are committed to progress and not perfection. And then lastly, we lead by example, looking to internally create equitable outcomes for our staff and for our members. And to be able to do that, we are using a framework. Last September, I got a chance to host a conversation with Glenn Harris, the CEO of Race Forward. And something he said to me, he described a framework of something that organizes the individual powers of the collective to work towards a common goal. If we think about organizations at its simplest form, an organization is just a group of people. And what I love about this framework is that it acknowledges for organizational change to happen, we have to focus on lifting up people, being hard on systems and easy on people. And again, at its simplest form, organization are people. And if we want to change organizations, we must also invest in supporting the learning, growth, and change in people. We believe that parks and recreation is a critical lever for addressing inequities in our communities. And to be successful, we have to focus on our professionals, help deep with DEI training, and that applies cultural competency and humility and community engagement. That will only happen if we are centered on equity in all functions, from planning, programming, maintenance, policy, and decision-making. We are committed to focusing on both systems and people, and this is how we will ensure diversity in our spaces, being honest with inclusionary history and working to grow as individuals and organizations. And with that, I will stop sharing and hand it over to Anna. You're on mute, Anna.
Hi there. I'm just getting my tech all set up here. Thank you, Autumn, for that presentation. I hope everybody can see my screen right now. Get this all set up. My name is Anna Tamara, and I am a manager in the Pacific West Regional Office in the planning program supporting 60 national park units across the Western and Pacific states, and with their large-scale planning needs. For the past 20 years, I've focused on planning, development, and interpretation of the Japanese American World War II incarceration sites. And I'm going to spend the next 10 minutes or so talking about the history, heritage, and sites associated with incarceration of Japanese Americans during World War II. This photograph that you see here is of Minidoka. It was one of 10 camps where Japanese Americans were incarcerated during World War II. It was designated as a unit of the National Park System in 2001. And this photo is of the entrance to the camp, where a ceremony is being held during a pilgrimage to the site by Japanese American survivors, descendants, and friends. The ceremony was to honor 73 young Japanese American men from Minidoka who were killed in action in service to the United States military in Europe and the Pacific during World War II, and while their families were incarcerated there. For me personally, this place is very important because this is a place where my mother and my family were incarcerated for the duration of World War II. I want to emphasize the power of communities in historic preservation work. For Japanese Americans, this work is about people learning from their elders, discovering their family's history through shared experience, honoring the sacrifices and hardships of our ancestors and elders, righting a wrong, and healing from intergenerational trauma. Ultimately, the purpose of historic preservation work at the Japanese American incarceration sites is about learning and education with the intention to not let this happen again to another group of people. And it's also to rededicate ourselves to equality and justice for all. I want to provide a brief history of the Japanese American incarceration during World War II, as I recognize that this history is either unknown or not well known by most Americans. It's important to recognize that prior to World War II, the United States had laws and policies that upheld systemic racism against immigrants from Asia and other countries. These laws and policies focused on property ownership, on housing discrimination, immigration, and naturalization. These racist policies and public sentiment created the conditions which led to the forced removal of Japanese Americans from the West Coast after the bombing of Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941. On February 19th, 1942, President Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066, which allowed the government to establish exclusion zones and cleared the way for the mass incarceration of Japanese Americans during World War II. On the map is a red line along the West Coast. All Japanese Americans living in Alaska and within the exclusion zone were rounded up and sent to the camps. The 10 main camps were located across 7 states and are indicated by the triangles on the map. All told, 120,000 Japanese Americans were incarcerated during World War II. 2/3 of them were American citizens by birth, and the other 1/3 were the immigrant generation denied the ability to become naturalized citizens. One important note is that the War Relocation Authority, which was the agency that oversaw the incarceration, was an agency within the Department of the Interior. The 10 incarceration centers were large-scale temporary facilities, rapidly constructed in remote locations. Most camps were surrounded by barbed wire fences and guard towers and guarded by military police. The image on the left is a bird's eye view of Minidoka, 3 miles in length. It held 13,000 people over the course of World War II and was the 7th largest population center in Idaho during that time. The image on the upper right is an on-the-ground view of Minidoka with 2 children walking along an elevated pathway. Following World War II, most of the camps were quickly dismantled. Many of them parceled out into homestead units and lotteried off to white World War II veterans. The lands were also left abandoned or modified for other purposes, such as an airstrip. Following World War II, the personal, social, and economic effects of the incarceration were devastating, and there continued to be intense racism and hate directed at Japanese Americans. Most people didn't talk about what had occurred for decades, and many tried to Americanize as swiftly and completely as possible. In many ways, people had to start over with their lives, having lost homes, businesses, and livelihoods because of the incarceration. The image on the lower right is a Japanese American family returning from Minidoka to their home in Seattle, Washington, to find a hateful racial slur painted on their ransacked garage. And I'll say that it's not hard to make the connection between the anti-Asian racism before and after World War II and the recent incidents of anti-Asian hate in the last couple of years. It wasn't until the late 1960s, 70s, and 80s, inspired by the Civil Rights Movement, that Japanese Americans started opening up about what had happened and questioning the actions of the US government and wanting to hold the government accountable. And it was during this time that community activists started organizing pilgrimages back to the camps to make sense of what had occurred and to recognize these places as significant places of injustice in our nation's history. Community groups pursued historic designations as well, including state historic landmarks, listing on the National Register of Historic Places, as well as designations as National Historic Landmarks. As a result of decades of community activism, the landmark Civil Liberties Act of 1988 was passed and signed by President Ronald Reagan. The act acknowledged that the incarceration was a fundamental injustice, and it determined that the incarceration of Japanese Americans was the result of, quote, race prejudice, war hysteria, and the failure of political leadership. The act allowed for an apology to all living survivors on behalf of the nation and provided reparations. The photograph you see on the left is of a group of people visiting the site of the Tule Lake Segregation Center in California during a pilgrimage. They're standing in front of a jail, which was used to imprison Japanese Americans that the government deemed disloyal to the United States. This building is considered one of the most important buildings related to the incarceration of Japanese Americans during World War II, as it's considered a jail within a US concentration camp. Tule Lake became a unit of the National Park System in 2008. And the photograph on the right is of Morgan Yamanaka, who was imprisoned in this jail during World War II. And he's looking at the plaque of designating Tule Lake as a National Historic Landmark. After about 20 years of activism on the part of Japanese American communities, Manzanar National Historic Site in California was designated as a unit of the National Park System. Today, 5 sites associated with incarceration history are designated as units of the National Park System. They include Manzanar and Tule Lake in California, Minidoka in Idaho, the Bainbridge Island Japanese American Exclusion Memorial in Washington State, and Honouliuli National Historical Site in Hawaii. And I'll say that each one of these places tells a different aspect of the World War II incarceration history. We also have the Japanese American Confinement Sites Grant Program that provides a 2-to-1 match for preservation, interpretation, and education activities. And also the National Park Service is conducting a congressionally mandated study of Amachi, which was one of the camps in Colorado. And the study is to evaluate the site for potential inclusion in the National Park System. I'll say that despite these great strides to preserve these sites in history, we also recognize that there is still much work to be done within the National Park Service related to Asian American history. This work includes accurate interpretation and use of terminology related to the Japanese American World War II incarceration history. It includes more work to be done in fully representing the histories and sites associated with other Asian American communities. Building and strengthening partnerships with Asian American communities and organizations related to heritage preservation, and also making sure that there's equitable access and welcoming of all people to our parks and heritage sites. There's also work to be done to increase the diversity of our National Park Service workforce. As an example, only 2% of the NPS workforce identifies as Asian American, compared to 6% of the American population. The photograph that you see shows one of the happiest days at Minidoka National Historic Site. It was in 2019 with a ribbon cutting by Japanese American survivors for the opening of the state-of-the-art visitor center. Today, this visitor center houses exhibits, an award-winning film, and rangers interpreting the history and importance of Minidoka to the public. Lastly, I would like to invite you all to learn more about this history by visiting the parks and connecting with them online through our websites and social media. And with that, thank you.
Great. I think I'm up next, right? Thank you, Anna. Thank you, Ecomos, for having me. I'm actually really invigorated by this conversation. It's wonderful to hear from Shantha about the changes that are underway at the Department of the Interior to ensure that the agency will be more inclusive. And of course, it was also great to hear from Dorothy, Autumn, and Anna about their incredible work in preserving diverse heritage. So before I start, just wanted to follow on Dorothy and Autumn's land acknowledgement, and wanted to recognize that I am speaking with you now from the ancestral lands of the Connecticut River Indians, some of the many Algonquin tribes that inhabited the lands that we now know as modern day Connecticut. So I'm Sarah Bronin. I am batting cleanup today. And so I thought I would pick up on some of the themes of the prior speakers and also add a little bit about my own experience. So I'm a law professor, I'm an advocate. I've really worked at the intersection of historic preservation, climate, transportation, and land use. And you'll see that in my short comments today. Among other activities, I currently serve on the board of Latinos in Heritage Conservation. And when I'm done, I'll put a link to their website in the chat. But we are a national group of historic preservation professionals. We work to raise awareness with sites associated with our history. And we work also to advance Latinos in the field of preservation. Over the last year or two, we've actually seen some incredible progress on Latino heritage. So we've seen the Museum of the American Latino moving forward, we hope. We saw last year the National Trust for Historic Preservation included on its endangered properties list the San Antonio Public Housing Complex. It's called the Alazan Apache Courts. We've seen attention to the Cesar Chavez National Monument Shantha mentioned, and also some hope of expanding that and other sites. But as I've continued to be involved in that group, I've come to realize just how underrepresented Latino stories have been and just how fragile our heritage is. And as somebody who focused primarily on law and policy at a very broad level, it has been eye-opening even for me to focus through this organization of professionals from all over the country on these issues. I should also say I have some personal experience. I'm Mexican American. My family is from the border of Texas and the southernmost city in the United States. I've had some personal experience with my own family being written out of the history for the southernmost National Park Service unit, actually the Fort Brown National Historic Landmark, because as it turns out, my ancestors' land was actually taken from them to create that site, and their contributions aren't really acknowledged at the site or even in the American Latino Heritage Survey that included that site. In the Latinos for Heritage Conservation, it's been really interesting, but also heartbreaking to see the many times that we're contacted by community groups and families that are concerned about a site that's associated with Latino history and that is about to be torn down, because by that point, it's usually too late. So all of that said, Latinos are really no different from many underrepresented groups. Often diverse histories are written out of the formal documentation of the sites themselves, the sites of the documentation showing their significance. That includes both World Heritage sites and National Park Service sites. So it's something that ICOMOS and other organizations have discussed, but even sites like Chaco and the Grand Canyon have significant Native American cultural relevance, but those are not really acknowledged by the inscriptions by the World Heritage, in the World Heritage inscriptions, or even if they are well known to all of us. So besides that formal recognition, and besides the issues that the other speakers have raised, I should say that most preservationists recognize that there is more to do. But what should we do? So yes, we definitely need to rewrite some of the inscriptions and the National Register nominations to be more inclusive. Yes, of course, we need to fill in the ranks of the National Park Service and the preservation field nationally with more diverse people. And definitely we have to raise awareness about preservation in more diverse communities, finding ways to engage with them that may not be the traditional ways we've engaged with people who care about their history. But one of the things that we haven't talked about yet today are what I like to call the rules of the game. So I tend to think that even as we're doing all of those other things and very important work, that unless we change preservation laws and policies, we will not necessarily be able to make the progress that we want, even if we are very well intentioned, and even if we are running full cylinders on engagement and advocacy and working within the system that we have to do things like rewrite nominations. So I'll just say a few things about opportunities that I think preservationists have over the next few years as the Biden administration starts to consider its policy priorities. So I think one really important thing that that we need to do at the federal level is to undertake a regulatory review of really every aspect of law and policy as it affects historic properties and as it erects barriers for the stories and the participation of women, people of color, and tribes. And so when I say regulatory review, that sounds maybe opaque, so I should probably say a little bit about the kinds of laws that I'm talking about. So one of the most significant is probably the National Park Service regulations that govern what kinds of properties we designate as historic, and also that govern the ways that we can rehabilitate those properties. So I know others on this call who I see in the participants list could talk for hours about this one particular aspect of the problem. But I should mention, probably for just this broader audience, that one of the issues, as an example, is the way that the National Park Service has come to define integrity through its regulations. So to be listed on the National Register, a site must have material integrity. The way that this requirement is sometimes articulated is that it leaves out sites that are less pristinely preserved. So the condition of some sites associated with underrepresented people may not necessarily be as pristine, may not satisfy what a traditional view of maintaining integrity means. So again, happy to talk more in the Q&A, but I'll leave the broad preservation and National Park Service regulations conversation for that. I also think, though, that beyond the preservation arena, there are other policy goals that we are seeing coming down the pike with the new Biden administration, and that I think are important for preservationists to be involved in. So, for example, the Biden administration recently announced that they would be advancing more inclusionary zoning policy. So we all know preservation provides naturally affordable housing, and if we drafted those policies right, those could really enable the reinvigoration of historic resources in underserved communities, because oftentimes zoning laws actually prevent historic resources in urban communities, in all communities really, from being rehabilitated because they're too narrow as to what kinds of things they allow. Similarly, we also know that the Biden administration has been pushing for significant action on the environment. I want to recognize, I'm not sure if anybody has yet, that today is Earth Day. So hearing Shantha talk about the Climate Corps, the 30 by 30 initiative, the Justice 40 environmental initiative, I think all of those present opportunities if we set them up correctly. But preservationists should be at the table in those conversations and should be willing to speak up and say, look, historic preservation is an important aspect of our solution to climate change. And more specifically, we need really much better documentation about what historic sites are out there and what historic sites are under threat from climate change. I mention that in the context of this conversation because there are so many sites associated with underrepresented people that are most at risk. And so when we're thinking very big picture about the kinds of conversations preservationists need to be involved with, disaster policy, disaster funding, trying to ensure that those policies and funding are directed to sites associated with underrepresented people. Again, it's a program design issue, and it's one that can help the Biden administration address climate change. We, again, are most likely to have sites threatened by flooding and other national hazards. So those were just a few things that I think others maybe didn't touch on today that I thought were worth raising in the context of this broader conversation about complex past and our diverse heritage. And with that, I'll leave it there. I know that there's, I'm sure, a lot of questions, and I'd love to hear what the other panelists have to say about those. So thank you.
Thanks, everyone. If the other panelists would turn their cameras on. I'm Destry Jarvis. I'm Vice President of US ICOMOS, and I'm going to moderate the Q&A session to the extent that it needs any. I'm certainly going to field the questions that we received and may throw in a few of my own, and look forward to getting some more. We don't have very many yet. One person asked whether the 30 by 30 initiative itself will be looking for diversity in the sites that are included, and more problematically perhaps, will the authorities provided for it include condemnation of private land? I don't know if anybody wants to take that on. That's a big question, but I pass it along if someone wants to speak to it. One specific question that was directed at Anna is, how were the original 10 incarceration sites chosen, their locations, for example?
Thanks. I was actually just typing that into the chat, but I'll verbalize it. There were 4 criteria for selecting the incarceration center facility locations. The first one was that the places needed to be remote locations away from population centers, so they couldn't be close to cities, right? The second one was access to the sites, and so close to railroads to bring in all the construction materials to construct the camps, to bring the people to the camps, and then everything that was needed to run the camps. The third criteria was that they needed to be large areas of land where at least 5,000 people could be housed. And then the last criteria was that they needed to be able to provide work opportunities for the incarcerees, which generally took the form of farming, land development, clearing of sagebrush, for example. So those were the 4 criteria.
Great, thank you, Anna. One person asked a very broad question. I'll open it to anyone who wants to answer. Is, what do you think is the biggest problem facing American and world heritage today?
I can answer that. I'd like to answer that one. I think it's climate change. I think that climate change is the biggest existential threat to mankind, of course, but specifically to our sites. If you look at the sites that are at threat of climate change, you see that it's not just a few fringe sites maybe on our coast. It's iconic sites, including even the Statue of Liberty, where the threats are multifaceted, they're complex. And unfortunately, we have actually no idea how big the threats are, and we have no idea where even, we haven't even documented on a national scale where our historic sites are. Sites on the state, local, tribal, and federal registers of historic places. So one of the reasons why I feel like this is such a big threat is because we haven't even quantified, and we don't even know the extent of the threat. So in looking at the announcement that this big infrastructure plan will include $5 billion for climate science, I think preservationists should be right at that table and say, if you are documenting where these threats occur, you've also got to figure out where these sites that mean so much to people occur. And then, of course, beyond that, identify the strategies that will be used to actually address those.
Great, thank you, Sarah. Anyone else want to take a stab at that?
Well,
go ahead.
If it's okay, I'd like to jump
Please,
in. I'd definitely not to argue against climate change, but I'd also like to add the importance of inclusionary history, right? Like, how many of us learned about internment camps, right, in high school history? How many of us learned about African American and Native sites in history? And for me, that lack of inclusionary history, knowledge, acceptance of things past, and encouragement to move forward and learn and recognize it's not you, it's a system, but here's what I can do to change. I'd like to offer that also as a huge barrier to historic sites, whether it's world, national, local, or state. If we don't know the history of a place because our history hasn't been inclusive, we are going to lose those. I mean, if we think about how many spaces have been important to people across the centuries, that because they have not been the one writing the history books, those places have been erased. So I just like to add that on as well.
Absolutely.
And I'd like to build on what Autumn is saying as well, and Sarah. And actually, to Sarah's point of her talk, which was how systemic racism is really embedded in the structures of historic preservation. And, you know, as a primary example about integrity of sites, so many of the places that are important to people of color were intentionally erased, right? Were intentionally paved over. And so to have integrity as one of those components, it's really challenging. I think then another piece is the financial barriers to designations, to writing nominations for National Register listings, for National Historic Landmark listings. Writing those nominations and the process they go through is very cumbersome. And trying to figure out how we can break down those barriers within our systems is really critical.
Hi, this is Dorothy. One of the things that we are doing internally within the National Park Service is looking at gaps. Where are we missing telling those stories? You know, like for the Native Americans and civil rights, where can those, there's a huge gap there, but where do we find those sites? And so, you know, that's some of the things that we're looking at. So if people have examples that they would like us to look at, different topics, different sites, please send those my way, and then I'll make sure that we take a look at all of that stuff, because it is a big problem, and it's something that I think within this current administration that we may be able to at least make an attempt at fixing. So
Thank you, Dorothy.
I want to just give a positive example of this. Which is here in Seattle, Washington. We have the Wing Luke Museum of the Asian American Pacific Experience, and it's an affiliated unit of the National Park System. And our cultural resources program in our region is working with the Wing Luke Museum to do an analysis and document sites associated with Asian American communities that have never seen the light of day, right? That haven't been discussed. And instead of focusing on communities that have been here for a long time, such as Chinese Americans, Japanese Americans, Korean Americans, it's shifting the focus to communities who don't have the capacity or or just gaining capacity to document their sites. So the Cambodian community, the Laotian community, so communities that are more new to the historic preservation world.
Great, thank you, Anna. In that regard, several people have asked, you know, what sites are of underrepresented people should be considered for national or World Heritage listing. I might mention that we did a webinar late last year on the serial nomination of civil rights movement sites that is on the tentative list that the Park Service is considering forwarding on to the World Heritage Center for possible inscription. That would be multiple sites in multiple states. The number is not prescribed at this point, but certainly a more modern piece of history, because it's focused in the 1960s, that would bring some of that diversity of World Heritage sites into a more modern and timely sense of attention. Several other people have asked, you know, if the focus is on National Park System units, but the Park Service, and several people have mentioned that Park Service administers the National Register of Historic Places program, and has affiliated sites like the Wing Luke Museum. And, is there sufficient utilization of these other tools to bring underrepresented communities and voices and peoples and their history into greater attention and prominence? Any thoughts on that?
I actually wanted to go back, if we could, to the first question about the eminent domain issue before we get too far away from that. I thought it was a really thoughtful question about how we choose what kind of land will be used to conserve. In the past, we've seen eminent domain being used against people of color, used to condemn at very low cost and sometimes no compensation whatsoever sites associated with sites where people live. That's what happened during the federal highway program. And I know that the question was really specific to reservoirs and land around reservoirs, but I wanted to just kind of say that eminent domain and its potential use in this, both at the federal level, but also at state and local levels too, is always something that, even as we're advancing other goals on climate, land conservation, that as a practice is not being used in a way that really repeats the mistakes that we made 50 years ago. So just wanted to circle back around to that before we got too far from it.
Great, Sarah. I mean, all of you have talked about diversity in the context of sites and of stories and of people. And while I know that we all want to progress on all three of those fronts, where would you put the priority for the immediate future among those three, if you dare to choose among those three? No takers. All right.
I'll jump in. I was, providing space. I do like to try and provide space, because I'll talk all day if you let me. When I first started this work, I was all about like policies and systems. And I think a lot of that was from, graduate work and really understanding how policies have excluded people over and otherized people over and over again. And as I've gotten older and done the work a little bit more, I continue, and this was represented in my presentation, I continue to come back to people, because again, you can have a so-so policy, and depending upon the people, their knowledge base, their communication skills, how they relate what they know, that policy can be implemented well or not, right? Depending on those variables. And so I am moving towards really focusing on competencies and skills and building that within people, because as we change and learn and grow, what happens? Everything we do changes, right? Like, as I've learned more and grown in equity and facilitation, I speak to my children differently, right? Like, as they fight, I approach it in a different way. And so for me, where I am, and we're really focusing on what are things that folks need to be able to sit with the difficulty, right? To be able to open their minds to different histories and things that they are unaware of. And in that knowledge and skill building, folks naturally change the way they interact with folks, what they're willing to preserve, what they think is important, right? How they set up policies and procedures. When when you know better, you do better. So I am solidly, and who knows, in 10 years, this may change, but right now I'm really, really hunkering down and focusing on if only with people.
Thank you, Autumn. This kind of relates to Sarah's point about integrity, but I've seen in recent years the Park Service paying a little more attention to cultural landscapes and traditional cultural properties that almost never include structures, or often are not even relevant to what is the condition of the site. It's more about the cultural lifeways that existed there at one point, or that still exist today and are often not acknowledged. So is the tool of TCPs or cultural landscapes one that can bring the Park Service along in lifting the barriers to a broader representation of history without regard to integrity?
Yeah, I mean, so I think that's an interesting point. I do think that there are so many issues related to tribal resources, and again, the pending potential threats to tribal resources that may arise with these other national policy goals that we heard about today and that we've been hearing in the news. One of the so for example, if we expand energy infrastructure, where are we putting it? And oftentimes we will, or at least in prior administrations, oftentimes energy infrastructure is proposed to be put on tribal lands. Another issue that's related to the question is about the religious aspects and sacred sites that are associated with tribal lands. And again, there's a lot of work that needs to be done. And I've been seeing in the chat and the Q&A, oh, I'd like to participate in this conversation. I'd like to participate in that conversation, and people sort of piping up to say, yes, I've seen these issues arise. And it almost, again, seems like there needs to be an entirely formal, structured process to really do the evaluations that we need to do with that equity lens. We're also seeing in the chat some other comments about current other programs and proposals, like an investment review board that has been started within the Department of the Interior, and again, potential threats to that. So there's so many different programs, and I think that it's really the tip of the iceberg but all woven together under this theme of, we need to talk about it. We need to say what we already know about these programs and policies, use TCPs and other things that we've done to loosen, or to show that loosening some of the strictest policies that keep diverse histories out of our national preservation program, isn't so bad. But also, we need to go a lot further than just using that one example.
Yeah. I think that we are on the verge of getting to a place where intrusion into the landscapes of underrepresented people will no longer be the path of least resistance, which is where industry and government has often gone, but maybe the path of hardest resistance, and that better ways to site facilities, transmission lines, power lines, pipelines can be found because of the recognition of this diversity and empowerment of those voices. Any thoughts on that?
This is Dorothy. I think, with once Standing Rock happened, it really truly highlighted a lot of those kinds of activities that were going on, and it's kind of continued to highlight the different areas where environmental justice has impacted not only Native communities, but communities of color. And actually, because it's highlighted it, it's been able to, with the current administration coming in, and already, with the different executive orders and presidential memorandums that he's put into place, it's going to make it even more so than what it was in the past. Right now with the pipeline in North Dakota, that's bringing on a tremendous fight again, from both the state and other people that are up there. So it's going to be very interesting to watch within the next couple of years. Oh.
Great, thank you, Dorothy. There's another question about whether any attention is being paid to the effect of climate change, presumably mostly related to sea level rise along coasts, in assuring that cultural people in those locations can be relocated in ways that allow them to continue their traditional cultural practices. I know of one example in Olympic National Park that was done some years ago by an act of Congress in a land deal that allowed tribal people along the coast to move further inland into what was park property. But there haven't been many examples of the opportunity chosen to do that. Anybody have any other thoughts about how that can be addressed? I'll throw in one, another important place that is not yet a World Heritage Site, but Fort Monroe National Monument in Virginia, which was the site in 1619 of the arrival of the first Africans in English North America, and the place where in 1861 the first enslaved people self-emancipated to arrive at the fort and seek asylum and were granted asylum. And by the end of the Civil War, there were some 10,000 people living there. And none other than Harriet Tubman was the matron of the hospital that cared for them. So UNESCO has designated Fort Monroe as a site, slave route of memory recently, but it sits on the coast, and it's the historic buildings flood frequently when heavy weather hits it. Places like that, you can't just pick up and move. So there are issues of climate change in coastal environments that will affect all sorts of cultural history.
Yeah, that and Alaska Native sites that are already being submerged. And, again, we see that primarily on the coast. This is a really difficult question because we know that sea level rise is going to threaten vulnerable historic places. It already has been. Historic Annapolis floods regularly, and you have that whole History Above Water series of conferences that have been trying to address this issue. From a federal policy level, we have not really seen any tools to help communities think about what they actually need to do. We have a sort of we have in place a scheme by which we have states and local governments do historic preservation programs, and they do hazard mitigation programs. But those two kinds of planning processes don't necessarily intersect. We also have at the federal level too, the standards, Secretary Standards for Rehabilitation, which trickle down to state and local decision makers because they have, and they don't have anything about relocation and how specifically communities should be relocated. So one of the resources that I put in the chat was where I talk about the Secretary Standards and say we do need a relocation set of guidelines that we can all at least start that conversation, as well as a deconstruction treatment in the standards for those resources and that have been built, but it will no longer be sustainable because of sea level rise, and also to deal with archaeological sites and tribal resources that are at risk. So I think that it's a really pressing issue for preservationists, and we simply haven't developed a strategy, or we have not developed the tools that we need to integrate that kind of planning from the top down and from the bottom up, because it's really both the groups that need to be heard.
Another questioner is asking whether the Secretary's standards for preservation might be a way to address both the integrity question and the broader representation question. Sarah, I think that might be for you again.
Yep, 100%. I think that's really one of the sources of the problems that we're seeing. And again, it's nobody's fault. This is just something that we've come to realize over time, that the way these have been articulated and the way they have been applied has not really met all of the goals that we have as a society, or even all the goals we have as preservationists. So they are something that they're a formal legal document. And again, I'm a law professor, so I always go to that as my first place of inquiry. But I think in this case, there's so many trickle down effects of those standards that it's something that's worth serious review and consideration, because preservation is essentially a formal field.
Are there any thoughts about how diversifying heritage can also be a benefit to community development in places around historic sites? I know that gateway towns around some historic places have benefited economically from those designations in many parts of the country, through increased visitation, tourism expenditures, and so forth. Any other thoughts about that?
This is Dorothy. One of the things that one of our park volunteers had done as part of his master's thesis was to really look into the local story of Native American slavery and how that was going on during the Indian Wars. So like a lot of times during the battles, all the Native men would be killed. So there may be a few women and children left. The soldiers would then take them into the local communities and either sell them or give them to the local community. So a lot of the children were taken in and used as slaves, up until they were 18. In the state of Arizona here, we actually had the Howell Code, which addressed that so that none of the children that were taken in as slaves could be adopted into the families. The girls could only be kept until they were 18 and the men until they were 21, at which time then they had to be released. And so it's really adding a whole new component to the story that's going to be told at the park. But one of the things when he was doing the different presentations along the way, he did a presentation at the local community library, and the community wasn't ready to hear that. They wanted to hear that she had been adopted into the family, was they talked about it like she was a beloved member of the family when she wasn't. When she was little, she was actually kept in a cage, and they called her a coon and different things like that. So it's really interesting how the local community wants to hear that story still to this day, as opposed to the way that it really was. So that's going to be kind of an issue, I think, with telling those hard truths, and with like I talked about in my presentation, getting those visitors to be able to acknowledge that that's part of our history.
And if I can add just a piece, I mean, I go to places specifically to see myself in the history of those. So I've started taking my kids to national parks. I love Harper's Ferry. I love it even more because of the rich Black history it has. And we consistently go to those places where I can make sure that my children see themselves. So I can only imagine by diversifying stories, making sure that folks understand. I mean, just on my timeline, seeing people that are going to the Harriet Tubman Trail and all of these new spaces, within the DMV area, I think it makes sense because it's a whole new population that are not just going there for the natural beauty. They're going there because they see themselves in these places. And I think that, money talks, right? We have money as well. And when you see yourself in that place, you want to go, you want to expose your friends and your family as well.
Terrific.
And just building on that, there's a sense of redemption in a way. There's a sense of finally being recognized, of history that has literally been erased, but going to a place where it's now interpreted, on a panel, or you can listen to a podcast, or have some experience there where you're learning. There's such incredible power in telling all American stories, and for Americans who don't feel represented, this is a way that the National Park Service can truly be more relevant for all Americans.
Terrific. another person's asking about whether the Park Service can be more like Australia and Canada, among others, in embracing the heritage communities in direct engagement in management of these places, not just telling the story. The Park Service has tentatively explored the idea of co-management with culturally relevant people in a few places, but it is not pervasive. Certainly the Japanese community's pilgrimages back to these incarceration sites engages the visitors at the same time in seeing and hearing these stories. And the number of Native American sites across the national park system are just ripe for the opportunity for tribal people to take charge of this, not only the story, but the site management. I think there's lots of opportunity for that. Australia and Canada have been doing it for years. We're just now getting our toes wet on this issue, but anybody have any thoughts about that?
Within the National Park Service, we can actually enter into contracts with tribes to take over like the interpretive part of the park. And so we've only done that with about 3 or 4 parks, but it's something that we're going to be working on within the next several years to get more of that to be, to get those compacts completed. And there is just amendments to the 93-638 Compacting Agreement Act, which is called the Progress Act. And I'm going to be on the rulemaking committee for that. So within the next couple of years, we'll be really working to see how we can work with tribes. And even if they don't have compacting agreements in place, like I said at Grand Canyon, the superintendent there really is working towards having ways that he can work with the tribes directly in every aspect of managing that park. It's really going to be a new era, for Park Service starting there at Grand Canyon.
That's terrific, Dorothy.
Mm-hmm.
I think we're getting close to the end of our allotted time here. Does anybody have any closing remarks they'd like to make before I turn it over to Doug for the finale? Okay, Doug, take it away.
Well, wow. All of you watching, thank you for joining this webinar. It is one that I think will be important, one that can point us in the right direction as we move forward. I'd like to thank the organizers, U.S. ICMOS Vice President Destry Jarvis, and our program coordinator, Victoria Van Hoos, and really convey profound thanks to our wonderfully informed and articulate presenters. It was a pleasure to listen to what you had to say. Shantha Ready Alonso, Sarah Bronin, Dorothy Firecloud, Autumn Sexton Ross, and Anna Tamara. A recording of this webinar will be sent to all attendees, and links to this webinar will be available on the US ICMOS website in a few days. Links to previous webinars can be found there now. I encourage you all to put US ICMOS in your web browser, visit our website, look at our webinars and the other activities and programs that we have developed to encourage diversifying heritage. And if you'd like to support these efforts, if you'd like to become involved, you can find on our website links that will take you to pages where you can apply for membership, and if you are so motivated, to support US ICMOS in other ways. Thank you again for being here today. I look forward to seeing you all again virtually and someday in person. We have multiple reasons for hope these days. Let's all hope and work together. Thank you again.